Today, for the first time in our series, we are celebrating the gift that translation brings to readers and writers, how it exposes us to literature at its widest scale, while also showing one of the ways in which art moves forward across geography and time. It was through the works of Elena Ferrante, Natalia Ginzburg, and more recently, Elena Ferrante, that I discovered the power of the domestic drama and the humor that family stories can have. The works of these Italian writers taught me that you can write importantly about family, and indeed, how much the subject matters to our larger collective story. Italo Calvino said, "Without translation, I would be limited to the borders of my own country. The translator is my most important ally. He introduces me to the world." It is my great pleasure to introduce three essential figures in the field of Italian translation. Giovanna Calvino, curator and caretaker of her father's Italo Calvino's literary estate, making certain that his enduring work is up to date in terms of translation and the ways in which language evolves over time. Anne Goldstein, translator of many of Italy's most important writers, but perhaps most famously recently the works of Elena Ferrante. And Jenny McPhee, my most beloved older sister, 2.5 years older, as I like to note. Jenny and I discovered Italian as teenagers, falling so deeply in love with the language that our worlds completely cracked open and we were, as Calvino said, introduced to the world. When you know someone as well as a sister knows her sister, a benefit is watching the flowering of early passion over time. Jenny's love of Italian took hold in a more ferocious commitment than mine. She fell in love not only with the language, but also with a man with whom she has been married for 25 years. Her first endeavor with translation, or one of her first, she'll correct me if I'm wrong, was to bring Pope John Paul II's Crossing the Threshold of Hope to the English-speaking world. Wanting to share the wealth, she dragged me into this enterprise until we were up to our necks in arcane Catholic philosophies and terms. The Pope's book, as we like to call it, sold over 9 million copies in English and led Jenny almost immediately into the world of literary translation, where she would come to work on such authors as Primo Levi, Natalia Ginzburg, and most recently, Anna Maria Ortese, whom Jenny has translated in collaboration with Anne Goldstein. For our undergraduates here, Jenny's teenage passion flourished, leading her to the epicenter of Italian translation, to Anne Goldstein, to Giovanna Calvino, to the conversation we are now fortunate enough to have today. Please help me welcome these distinguished writers and translators. So I wanted to begin by having them introduce themselves briefly. So Calvino, Giovanna, would you begin?
Sure. Can you hear me? So I am here with my capacity as the overseer of my father's literary estate. His books are translated in dozens of languages, and I know a few, very few of those languages, and where I know them, I try to follow the quality of the translation, and it's a bit of it's a game at which I can only lose, because of course my father's voice in another language is never my father's voice, so I'm never satisfied. So in any case, because I grew up in France, I follow very closely the retranslation of all his works in French. My mother is from Argentina, so she's better at following the translations in Spanish. And with English, I am lucky to not have to worry too much, because the latest translation was done by Anne Goldstein, so I didn't even have to
Thank you. Anne?
Well, I became, like many people, I became a translator sort of by accident. I was learning Italian, and I was working at the New Yorker. I worked for many years at the New Yorker as in the copy department. So I'm really a copy editor, actually. But translation, I studied Italian, and then I became interested in it, and I just sort of for my own interest, decided to translate a book called Chekhov in Sondrio by a writer called Aldo Buzzi, who most people are not that familiar with, including most Italians. But the translation was published, and that was really how I began translating. And I really loved doing it, and so sort of one thing led to another. Actually, one thing led to Jenny, but she can tell that. So since then, I've been translating very many Italian writers, both famous and not famous.
Thank you. Jenny?
So, Martha, thank you for that introduction. Martha sort of began the story of how I got into translation. So I did a junior year abroad in Italy, and the pull of the Italian culture and Italian language was such that I eventually ended up living there after graduating from college, where I would work on, I worked for an Italian publisher, curating actually the English text, publish everything both in English and Italian. And so that is where I really got my learning, my Italian language ability was living and working for a publisher for almost 2.5 years. Anyway, then I went back to the United States where I was working for Alfred A. Knopf, a publisher that was renowned for their translations. But it was a time when they were sort of shifting. They'd been bought by Random House, and it was a time where translation was not really selling very well, and they never sold very well, but they were sort of moving away from concentrating on that as their profile. And so as a very young editor, I was given all the translations to edit. So I was editing people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Pierre Assouline, Pierre Paolo Guadagnini. And while I was there, at a certain point, it came out that the Pope was going to be writing this, or had written this book, this great book. And of course, he'd written other books, but this was the book that was going to be the big bestseller. He was coming to America, and he would be there in 5 months. He'd be coming in 5 months. So very quickly, an excerpt of the book had to be translated. And my editor-in-chief happened to know that I knew Italian, and so when they bought the book, he sent me home and said, "You have 1 month to translate this book." And so that's when I enlisted Martha to help me out. And for 1 month, we would literally holed up in my apartment and fought over everything. It was really tough going, but it actually enabled me to start working part-time and pursue my real dream of being a writer. And really what I have to offer too is that how being a writer and how being a translator at the same time are really such fabulously complementary activities. But in any case, the Pope book, after translating that, he was Polish actually, but the text was in Italian. It was a very weird experience when all the translators from all across the world were all invited to the Vatican. I was the only woman, and I was not allowed to go. So it was just, that was my first translation experience, and I thought after that, I cannot let this be the last one. So then another book, an opportunity came along, Paolo
So I'd like to ask why translation is important. It might seem very obvious, but in America, we don't read as much in translation as I think we should be. So how do those two things fit together, and how do we increase the audience? But it might be by beginning to understand why it's so essential. Anne, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I mean, the obvious things are the world is a big place, and it's not just America. And in order to understand ourselves, I think better, it might be helpful to understand other people, other cultures, other places, other languages, other ways of putting words together. I think these are all important things for ourselves as well as for understanding other people.
Giovanna?
Well, I was about to say that perhaps Americans have a sense of superiority with respect to the other countries of the world because America is the biggest power. But then I think in France, the French think that they're the top, and but they do translate a lot, and when you're in the States, as soon as you have an accent, you are a foreigner. Whereas in Italy or in France, when you have an accent, they want to place you. They want to place the exact country you're from. And I don't know, in America there is this idea that there's us, the Americans, and then there's the foreign world, right? And for some reason, if you want to sell a book well in America, you have to pretend that it was written in English.
Yes, I just want to add some statistics to that. So in America, we publish, out of all the books that we publish a year, 3% are in translation. And in France, say, or Italy, or Korea, that number is really much more towards 50-60%. So why is that? I mean, is it to Giovanna's idea that it's a kind of imperialist, to English as imperialism? Well, in England, that 3% number is still true, and they're quite I was going to say, oh, it's geographical, but it is sort of an English phenomenon. It's not a geographical or national phenomenon. So it's a very interesting provincialism, isn't that English?
And is there any cure?
We're doing our best.
Well, that said, there are lots of translations still happening. So it would seem that the state of literary translation in this country is in a good place with the New York Review of Books.
So just to speak to that a little bit, I do think that we're
Is it
3.5%?
Who are publishing translations. We know of small houses that are publishing just translations, and others that are doing a lot of translations. So that's really important.
Yeah, in the last last 5 years, the smaller, but there have been just flourishing of small publishers that are specializing in translation. So that's really comforting.
That's great. So I'm going to break up this conversation with a few readings. The first will be Giovanna reading in Italian a brief excerpt from one of her father's books, and then Anne will read her translation. So would you like to do that? Yeah, sure.
This novel is called, in English, The Baron in the Trees, and in Italian Il Barone Rampante. It's set in the 18th century, and it's the story of a little boy who one day, because he's angry with his family, he climbs on a tree on their land, and he spends the rest of his life in the trees. So I will read the beginning of chapter 4 in Italian. Io non so se sia vero quello che si legge nei libri, che in antichi tempi una scimmia che fosse partita da Roma, saltando da un albero all'altro, poteva arrivare in Spagna senza mai toccare terra. Ai tempi miei, di luoghi così fitti d'alberi, c'era solo il golfo d'Ombrosa, da un capo all'altro e la sua valle fin sulle creste dei monti. E per questo i nostri posti erano nominati dappertutto. Ora già non si riconoscono più queste contrade. S'è cominciato quando vennero i francesi a tagliar boschi come fossero prati, che si falciano tutti gli anni e poi ricrescono. Non sono ricresciuti. Pareva una cosa della guerra, di Napoleone, di quei tempi. Invece non si smise più. I dossi sono nudi che a guardarli, noi che li conoscevamo da prima, fa impressione. Allora, dovunque s'andasse, avevamo sempre rami e fronde tra noi e il cielo. L'unica zona di vegetazione più bassa erano i limoneti, ma anche là, in mezzo, si levavano contorti gli alberi di fico, che più a monte ingombravano tutto il cielo degli orti, con le cupole del pesante loro fogliame, e, se non erano fichi, erano ciliegi dalle brune fronde, o più teneri cotogni, peschi, mandorli, giovani peri, prodighi susini, e poi sorbi, carrubi, quando non c'era un gelso o un noce annoso. Finiti gli orti, cominciava l'oliveto, grigio argento, una nuvola che sboccava a mezza costa. Sopra gli olivi cominciava il bosco. I pini dovevano un tempo aver regnato su tutta la plaga, perché ancora si infiltravano in lame e ciuffe di bosco, più per i versanti fino alla spiaggia del mare, e così i larici. Le roveri erano più frequenti e fitte di quel che oggi non sembri, perché furono là prima e più pregiata vittima delle scure. Più in su i pini cedevano ai castagni, il bosco saliva la montagna e non se ne vedevano confini. Questo era l'universo di linfa, entro il quale vivevamo, abitanti d'Ombrosa, senza quasi accorgercene. Il primo che vi fermò il pensiero fu Cosimo. Capì che le piante, essendo così fitte, poteva, passando da un ramo all'altro, spostarsi di parecchie miglia senza bisogno di scendere mai. Alle volte un tratto di terra spoglia lo obbligava a lunghissimi giri, ma lui presto si impratichì di tutti gli itinerari obbligati e misurava le distanze non più secondo i nostri estimi, ma sempre con in mente il tracciato contorto che doveva seguire sui rami. E dove neanche con un salto si raggiungeva il ramo più vicino, prese a usare degli accorgimenti, ma questo lo dirò più in là. Ora siamo ancora all'alba, in cui, svegliandosi, si trovò in cima a un'elce, tra lo schiamazzo degli storni, madido di rugiada, fredda, intirizzito, le ossa rotte, il formicolio alle gambe e alle braccia, e felice si diede ad esplorare il nuovo mondo.
I don't know if it's true that, as you read in books, in olden days a monkey that left Rome, jumping from tree to tree, could reach Spain without touching the ground. In my time, the only place where the trees were so dense was the shoreline of the Gulf of Ombrosa, from one end to the other, and its valley up to the mountain ridges. And for that reason, our district was renowned everywhere. These places are no longer recognizable. First the French came, cutting down woods as if they were fields that are reaped every year and grow back. They didn't grow back. It seemed a thing of the war, of Napoleon, of the times, but it didn't stop. The hills are bare, so that to look at them for us who knew them before is disturbing. At that time, wherever we went, we always had leaves and branches between us and the sky. The only place where the vegetation was lower was the lemon groves, but in their midst rose twisted fig trees, which higher up obstructed the whole sky over the gardens with the cupolas of their dense foliage. And if not figs, it was brown-leaved cherries, or the more tender quinces, peach, almond, and young pears, fruitful plums, and then service trees or carobs when it wasn't a mulberry or an ancient walnut. Where the gardens ended, the olive grove began, silver gray, a cloud with fraying edges. Above the olives, the woods began. The pines must once have reigned over all the region because they still infiltrated the slopes in slivers and clumps down to the shore of the sea, as did the larches. The oaks were denser and thicker than they seem today because they were the first and most prized victims of the axe. Higher up, the pines gave way to chestnuts, the woods went up the mountain, and no limits could be seen. This was the universe of sap in which we lived, we the inhabitants of Ombrosa, almost without noticing it. The first to fix his thoughts on this was Cosimo. He understood that since the trees were so thick, he could travel many miles, going from branch to branch, without ever having to get down. At times, a stretch of bare earth obliged him to make lengthy detours, but he soon learned all the necessary routes, and he measured distances not according to our estimates, but always having in mind the circuitous path he had to follow along the branches. And where he couldn't reach the nearest branch even with a leap, he began to use some contrivances, but I'll talk about that later. Now we are still in the dawn, when, waking, he found himself at the top of a holm oak, amid the din of the starlings, soaked with cold dew, stiff, his bones aching, pins and needles in his legs and arms, and happily he began to explore the new world.
So, Cervantes said that translation is the other side of the tapestry. What does he mean by that? And hearing you both read the same text, it might be a way to start trying to answer that. Giovanna?
I don't know what he meant, what Cervantes meant, but reading all the names of the trees, I remembered that, so my grandparents were botanists. My grandmother was a botanist and he was an agronomist. And my father regretted that he did not pay more attention to when he was walking in the countryside with his dad. His father knew the name of every single plant, and he didn't. And this book he wrote after his father's death, and in naming every plant, I think it's a way to catch up for the things he regretted not doing when his father was alive. And when I read in any language a list of trees like this, because I don't know anything about botany, I need to translate it into images. I need to Google the name of the tree and see what it looks like to have an idea of it. So there are words that are translations, whichever, even if they're in your own language, they're in a foreign vocabulary.
So when Anne translates that text, what's your relationship to her work? And is it a collaboration, or she does it and you? Or
in Anne's case, she completely did it. In the case of other translators who maybe did not have as much time to work on the book, I would proofread and correct. everything that needed to be corrected.
Can I just make a comment? So I love what you say, Giovanna, because it's one of my sort of personal theories that all writers are translators, whether they are working in another language or not, and that the activity of writing, we're going from our head to the page, but we're also translating worlds, whether it's this world or the world of botany, or in our father's case, the world of geology. The activity of a writer and a translator is always translating something for the reader. So I just love that you say that. It really resonates with me and what the whole activity of translation really is about.
And what is the most difficult part of translating?
Everything. No, I mean, I think we used to say at the New Yorker that our goal was not to make everybody sound the same, which is what people seem to think, but to make every writer sound as good as he or she could sound, as to be the best writer that he or she could be. And I think that the translator is really doing the same thing, is bringing the voice of a writer in one language into the best voice in, well, in my case, English, that writer can have. I mean, the most, I don't know what best means, but whatever you mean by best, but the most true to that writer, to bring that voice into English. And I think that's the difficulty of translation, is to keep is to have a writer or a book that is somehow the same book, but also a different book. I mean, it's a little bit abstract. There, obviously, the practical side is tremendous, but
Right. Well, it seems like you have to go very deep, like into the mechanics of the writing in order to.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's really sort of a word by word experience. You're translating words, then you're translating a sentence, let's say, or a phrase, a sentence, then you're translating a paragraph. Eventually you have a whole book, but yes.
I also think that the relationship of the translator to both the text and the psyche of the author that you're translating is one of the most intimate relationships you can possibly have, because you have to understand the intent through the language and live with that person's language day by day, hour by hour, year by, as long as it takes. And in fact, Anne and I were at a conference at NYU the other day together with another translator, and we had all worked on the Primo Levi retranslation of all the Primo Levi opus together, and we were just sitting around talking about how those were some of the most difficult and depressing times of our translation experience. He is obviously an amazing writer, but we all felt his deep sadness and depression. Even though I was translating sort of sci-fi light stories, I felt all the time the underlying anxiety and sadness.
And from the other side, I was reading the translations of my father's books in a certain language, and I could see very well which books the translator didn't like, because it just showed from, I could see that he was irritated. And that's not good. I mean, what Anne was saying, that you want to translate and to give the best version of the writer you can, you have to pay attention to not, also to not make the writer better than they really are, which has happened. There are super bestsellers that I won't mention, that it is said that the English translation is better than the original.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez said, "Do not read 100 Years of Solitude in Spanish. Read it in English. It's a far better book." That also it reminds me of another thing, is that no two translators will translate a book and it will be the same thing. Every translator is going to bring so much of themselves to a translation. So each work, there is no such thing as a perfect translation. There's no such thing as a literal translation. Each translation is very unique to, if Anne and we'll get to our collaboration on this latest book, but if we were to translate the same book, we would come up with very different things.
Giovanna, as a curator of your father's literary estate, and as with time going by and language evolving, is that one of the things that you are paying attention to, and how do you retranslate, and how often, and what usually is the impetus behind that?
Yes, definitely. Some of his books have been translated in the early 60s, and the translations have aged. So they need to be, you realize that language changes, and it's it's difficult to convince a publisher to retranslate a book that already exists in translation, but it's also a wonderful opportunity to make the work new in a way, because the new translation will be in the language of today. It will make the language more accessible in a way, or more familiar, more relatable. So I'm a great fan of retranslated everything.
It's an interesting phenomenon, but translations date much more than the original.
Right. I mean, can you explain that? Because
I actually think I can't explain it really. I mean, just because the translation is so much more, seems to be so much in the language of its time, and somehow the original is in the language of its time, but the book is of its time. So I can't explain it. Can you?
No, just that every translator is going to bring their culture, prejudices, interests. Biases.
So they're bringing their time.
They're bringing their time, right?
But I mean, there are famous translations
that endure.
That endure.
For example, Proust. Although Lydia Davis's translation, I'm glad it exists. It's wonderful. It's very different than the Moncrief. And if I go back to read Proust, I go to Moncrief. And maybe that's about also the first time you read a work is you're going to fall in love with the translation, I think, or not. But,
right.
So you always, that's your Proust, is the Moncrief Proust. Or if you read Davis first, it'll be Davis's Proust.
So with all this possibility in terms of translation, on the drive out here, actually, you were talking about mistranslations. And will you speak to that?
Yes, I was thinking that I'm obsessed with finding the right word, and in fact, mistranslations are just as important and consequential in our culture. If you think of the line of what Jesus said, allegedly said, it's more difficult for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. It wasn't a camel, of course. I mean, of course, maybe it's not widely known, but the word for camel and for rope in Greek and perhaps in Aramaic are very similar. So at some point, a scribe, whether it was in the first translation into Greek or just later on, a scribe who was tired or distracted wrote camel instead of rope. The eye of the needle is the needle that would
with which they would repair the fishing nets. And the rope is the specific rope he spoke about is the rope that is attached to the anchor of a ship. So it makes more sense that this rope is really anchored to the earth and cannot reach heaven. However, the metaphor that a camel goes through the eye of a needle is much more fun, and we can, and it also gives more freedom to create absurd literature like UNESCO or Gertrude Stein, and like this in the Gospels, but also in the Bible as a whole, there are many mistranslations that have influenced our culture in fundamental ways.
Thank you. You want to add the anecdote?
I know another one where Moses in Genesis is described as having very curly hair in Greek, but then it comes out in Latin that it's actually he has horns. So then you go through the Renaissance and you see all these fabulous sculptures by Bernini and so on with Moses with two little horns coming out of it. And it was all because of a mistranslation. So yes, it's...
And then becomes part of the culture.
And yeah, very much. So what is Moses doing with horns? But yeah, and then just another example, this isn't really mistranslation, but it's an interesting thing I came across in being scared of translating a certain word. So I recently translated Natalia Ginzburg's Lessico Familiare, family lexicon, and on the very first page, the father of her family, and this book describes sort of the rise of fascism in Italy right before World War II, and then describes World War II and what happens to her family, which is a Jewish family in Turin, completely assimilated. Anyway, on the father is sort of a tyrant, and on the very first page of her book, the father's screaming at the children, and he's calling the children imbeciles and idiots and Negroes. And he goes on to say, you do all of these things, these negrigure, which I translated as Negroisms. In previous translations, the translators had decided to leave that out and call them yahoos or imbeciles to translate the word Negro, so that they avoid the issue entirely. However, it's my strong feeling that that was very deliberate on the first page of Natalia Ginzburg's book, because she's writing about fascism, she's writing about family structure, she's writing about social structure, inequality, racism, and even that offhanded kind of cultural, what we would call right now microaggression, is going to have a huge effect, and is part of the reason why fascism can flourish, because it is in our very language, it's in our very social structures and how language reflects that. So I thought it was a very important word actually to keep in the book.
Would you like to read?
Oh, sure. Okay, so Anne and I can talk a little bit about this book after I read, just about how we came to actually translate this book together, because it was a history and a process. But we did translate this book together. Anna Maria Ortese, who is a Neapolitan writer from sort of the 50s, 60s. She actually died in the 80s. And she is Elena Ferrante says she was a huge influence on her writing. She's actually was incredibly well known in her time. Women writers have a tendency to be forgotten, and she has been certainly overlooked. Dacia Marini, who's also another very well-known Italian writer, was recently at NYU, and
she was saying Anna Maria Ortese, and especially this book, was one of the great classics of Italian literature, and yet no one hears of her much anymore. This book, just to give you a little background, is sort of a collection of short stories, so real fiction, then there's reportage in there, and then the final section, which is sort of half the book, is kind of, it's nonfiction, it's autobiographical, and it's sort of vignettes of her wandering around Naples and describing what she sees and her past there and her involvement in the literary community there. But I'm going to read from the very first story, which is called A Pair of Eyeglasses. A Pair of Eyeglasses. As long as there's the sun, the voice of Don Peppino Quaglia crooned softly near the doorway of the low, dark basement apartment. Leave it to God, answered the humble and faintly cheerful voice of his wife, Rosa, from inside. She was in bed, moaning in pain from arthritis, complicated by heart disease, and addressing her sister-in-law, who was in the bathroom, she added, "You know what I'll do, Nunziata? Later I'll get up and take the clothes out of the water." "Do as you like. To me it seems real madness," replied the curt, sad voice of Nunziata from that den. "With the pain you have, one more day in bed wouldn't hurt you." A silence. "We've got to put out some more poison. I found a cockroach in my sleeve this morning." From the cot at the back of the room, which was really a cave, with a low vault of dangling spider webs, rose the small, calm voice of Eugenia. "Mama, today I'm putting on the eyeglasses." There was a kind of secret joy in the modest voice of the child, Don Peppino's third-born. The first two, Carmela and Luisella, were with the nuns, and would soon take the veil, having been persuaded that this life is a punishment. And the two little ones, Pasqualina and Teresella, were still snoring as they slept feet to head in their mother's bed. "Yes, and no doubt you'll break them right away," the voice of her aunt, still irritated, insisted from behind the door in the little room. She made everyone suffer for the disappointment of her life, first among them that she wasn't married and had to be subject, as she told it, to the charity of her sister-in-law, although she didn't fail to add that she dedicated this humiliation to God. She had something of her own set aside, however, and wasn't a bad person, since she had offered to have glasses made for Eugenia when at home they had realized that the child couldn't see. "With what they cost, a grand total of 8,000 lire, she added. Then they heard the water running in the basin. She was washing her face, squeezing her eyes, which were full of soap, and Eugenia gave up answering. Besides, she was too pleased. A week earlier, she had gone with her aunt to an optician on Via Roma. There, in that elegant shop full of polished tables and with a marvelous green reflection pouring in through a blind, the doctor had measured her sight, making her read many times through certain lenses that he kept changing, entire columns of letters of the alphabet printed on a card, some as big as boxes, others as tiny as pins. "This poor girl is almost blind," he had said then, with a kind of pity to her aunt. "She should no longer be deprived of lenses." And right away, while Eugenia, sitting on a stool, waited anxiously, he had placed over her eyes another pair of lenses with a white metal frame and had said, "Now, look into the street." Eugenia stood up, her legs trembling with emotion, and was unable to suppress a little cry of joy. On the sidewalk, so many well-dressed people were passing, slightly smaller than normal, but very distinct. Ladies in silk dresses with powdered faces, young men with long hair and bright-colored sweaters, white-bearded old men with pink hands resting on silver-handled canes, and in the middle of the street, some beautiful automobiles that looked like toys, their bodies painted red or teal, all shiny. Green trolleys as big as houses with their windows lowered, and behind the windows so many people in elegant clothes. Across the street, on the opposite sidewalk, were beautiful shops with windows like mirrors, full of things so fine, they elicited a kind of longing. Some shop boys in black aprons were polishing the windows from the street. At a cafe with red and yellow tables, some golden-haired girls were sitting outside, legs crossed. They laughed and drank from their colored glasses. Above the cafe, because it was already spring, the balcony windows were opened and embroidered curtains swayed, and behind the curtains were fragments of blue and gilded paintings, and heavy, sparkling chandeliers of gold and crystal, like baskets of artificial fruit. A marvel. Transported by all that splendor, she hadn't followed the conversation between the doctor and her aunt. Her aunt, in the brown dress she wore to Mass, and standing back from the glass counter with a timidity unnatural to her, now broached the question of the cost. Doctor, please get us a good price, we're poor folk. And when she heard 8,000 lire, she nearly fainted. 2 lenses? What are you saying? Jesus, Mary! Look, ignorant people, the doctor answered, placing the other lenses after polishing them with the glove. Don't calculate anything. And when you give the child 2 lenses, you'll be able to tell me if she sees better. She takes 9 diopters on one side and 10 on the other, if you want to know. She's almost blind. While the doctor was writing the child's first and last name, Eugenia Quaglia, Vicolo della Cupa at Santa Maria in Portico, Nunziata had gone over to Eugenia, who, standing in the doorway of the shop and holding up the glasses in her small, sweaty hands, was not at all tired of gazing through them. Look, my dear, see what your consolation costs. 8,000 lire, did you hear? A grand total of a good 8,000 lire. She was almost suffocating. Eugenia had turned all red, not so much because of the rebuke as because the young woman at the cash register was looking at her while her aunt was making that observation, which declared the family's poverty. She took off the glasses. But how is it, so young and already so nearsighted? The young woman had asked Nunziata, while she signed the receipt for the deposit. And so shabby, too, she added. Young lady, in our house we all have good eyes. This is a misfortune that came upon us, along with the rest. God rubs salt in the wound. Come back in 8 days, the doctor had said. I'll have them for you. Thank you.
Is it unusual for people to translate together? Is that unique to the situation?
Not completely unusual. I mean, there's the Russian team of Fair and Volkonsky. I think it's perhaps more unusual. I mean, they're sort of one Russian and one Russian person and one English-speaking person. We're 2 English-speaking people. So I think it was a little more unusual in that sense.
What was the process like? Did you work on that passage as well? Do you both work on the same?
For the first round, we divided up arbitrarily. We divided up the stories, and we each did a first draft, and then we just passed them back and forth. So we both worked on all the stories to the point where we really don't know who wrote what.
Interesting.
So I maybe what we could tell you just a little bit about how we came to know each other and our translation trajectory. So while I was at Knopf, this really crazy book by Pier Paolo Pasolini called Petroleum was given to me to edit and find a translator and so on. And it was unfinished, full of several sentences, many different passages that he wrote several times, and it was really kind of a mess. So the way things go, you send out passages to different translators, and they, as a little trial, and of course Anne was one of those, and that's how we first met. So that was 25 years ago. So our translation careers have kind of gone hand in hand, and so
were you asked by the publisher to translate together, or was it something?
No.
This was your idea.
Yeah. So then again, I wrote novels. I moved away. I was back in the U.S. and I was in the subway, and I'd been translating a contemporary novel by somebody who was still alive and a friend, and it was a horrible experience because every sentence I wrote, I translated, she had a problem with. So it was tough going, and that can be what happens with live translators sometimes. It's not such a great, live authors and translators, sometimes it's not such a great relationship, although yours with Elena Ferrante has been very good.
Oh, yeah,
so we'll get
nothing
to that.
like an absent author.
But anyway, so I was getting off the subway at 42nd Street, and Anne was getting on, and I was living in England then. She says, "How are you?" And I said, "What are you working on?" And I was like, "Oh, this is terrible. I'm having such a terrible time with this person. No, from now on, I'm only translating dead people." And Anne says, I have a dead person for you, Primo Levi. And so we, again, collaborated on that, although she was the editor this time and I was the translator. And again, it was a really great working relationship, though, because we had a lot of great conversations. In translation, you have infinite possibilities in terms of your word choices, and sort of being able to bounce it off somebody was really great in that. And then I thought, just in all of translation theory and the whole process of translation, and my whole idea about writing and translating all be the same thing, in that also translation is a conversation over time with authors, readers, translators. I thought, wouldn't it be really great to translate something where you're so into the text with somebody else that you don't even know who really is the author, who is the translator, so that was the impulse to kind of do it in this way that we did.
And did you suggest Ortese to the publisher?
That was, actually the publisher was talking about, the publisher actually brought it to me. And then I said, oh God, I would really love to do that. And then I thought, I'd really love to do that with Anne in this way.
Interesting.
It was a great experience because the translator's usually, as you say, the translator's usually working on his or her own and thinking, what does the writer mean? What word should I use here? What should I do here? And to have that experience of somebody else as involved in the text who would have an opinion about that word or the meaning of some phrase or something it was great.
Also, so Anne and I, sort of as our little profile as translators, we're kind of on a spectrum, and she tends to sort of stick to if there's anything literal, she tends to stick more literally, and I tend to take way too many liberties. So it was a good balance that way too.
Now, I realized that Ferrante was influenced by Ortese, is that correct? Or she was inspired by it?
I don't think I would say it even that directly, but certainly Ortese was one of the writers that Ferrante looked up to, I guess you could say.
And could you feel that in translating both?
Well, I hadn't read Ortese when I worked on Ferrante.
Oh.
Came later. I mean, they're actually very different writers, but as you were saying yesterday, I mean they both exposed Naples in some sense and exposed Italy, and they were both vilified for that essentially. I mean, they wanted to show Naples the way Naples is, and Ferrante certainly was not. That was one of the reasons that she was not popular in Italy to begin with.
And Ortese had a very similar. So they really are. Both of them are very directly critical of Naples and of what happened, the corruption in Naples, the poverty, and why they expose the poverty, show the poverty, and also show why that poverty is it flourishes. And so in Ortese's case, when she wrote this book, she was really so hounded that she was hounded out of Naples and never went back to live there because it was so raw what she was doing.
And translating this, if it is about also, capturing the world and putting that into English, it's such a distinct world. How does that play a part in the way you're thinking when you're involved in the translation?
I don't think it, I don't know. I don't think I think on those terms when I'm translating. Or in those terms. I think that it's more that you're thinking about, well, as I said earlier, trying to convey what is in the words of that writer to make real on the page another world. And I think that, here, showing my bias, it seems to me that if you can be as exact as possible, well, within the limits of reason, of English, that's how you're conveying that.
And what was the experience like of translating for Elena Ferrante? That so much changed from when you started to when you concluded the quartet. She blasted onto this. Everybody fell in love with her. She became. It became a phenomenon, and
Yes.
You were always translating, a year in advance.
And since nobody knew who she was,
and she was anonymous.
I
face
became
of
the
Elena.
face of Elena Ferrante. But I am, of course, not Elena Ferrante. Nor have I ever met her. I don't know who she is. But in terms of being a translator, it was. I think it's actually been good for all translators, and I felt that it was important to represent Ferrante. Not that I am Ferrante, but because I thought it was important for people to realize that there's a translator involved in bringing the work to readers, and that if there was a translator involved in that, there was a translator involved in many other works that people would almost take for granted. Let's say that they're just reading this book, they're reading The Baron in the Trees, but there's actually two people there.
Which brings me to another, just a thought about the world thing and translating the world to, as you were pointing out before, that traditionally people have said, oh, it was such a great translation, you would think it had been written in English. And the sort of movement of translators now is that that's no longer really a compliment. It's sort of like that compliment, oh, you don't seem American, So what we're really looking to do, in a way, or what I think a really good translation also incorporates, is something called language difference. So that when you're trying to evoke the world of Naples, for example, in Neapolitan Chronicles, there's a lot of dialect. So often we would keep the dialect in the original Italian, or the original dialect, and then translate it next to it in order to maintain that language difference and in order to signal to the reader, yes, this is a translation, this has a past in a different language, in a different world.
This reminds me of the way, I don't know if it's only the Italian school of restoration, that when they restore a fresco or a painting, from a distance you don't see any difference, and when you go closer, you actually see the part that was restored, because it's done in a way that emerges, and in this way they show you this was restored. This is not the original, and it's an interesting way to work.
What's the role of women in translation today? What's happening? on that front?
So of that 3% of books that are translated, I think it's 25% of those are women authors. And then the male-female ratio in translators, I think, is pretty even.
I don't think so. There are a lot of women translators.
Yeah, but what is getting translated is predominantly male.
And are you working to change that?
Okay, so there's another story. When I said no more dead people, I said no more men. So I haven't really stuck to that. I have done recently a book by Giovanna Calvino, so. But I'd like to translate more women where I tend to lean that way. Right.
Well, I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have questions, you can go to the speaker, the microphone, right there. Yes.
I'm pretty loud.
I know, I think well, yes. I think they need it for the live streaming.
Ms. McPhee, you said that you lived in Italy and
Yes.
attained certainly a level of fluency. And Ms. Calvino, you were surrounded by languages, obviously, in growing up. How did you, Ms. Goldstein, attain the level of fluency in Italian that you obviously have attained?
Kind of in an informal way. I actually, to my great regret, have never lived in Italy. I spent a fair amount of time there, but I really learned by, well, we had a class at the New Yorker, actually. That's how I started learning Italian. And then I took some other classes, and I just read a lot. That's really how I did it. And I started very late, too.
That makes me think of another question, which is how good does your understanding of the language you're translating need to be? Now, that might sound stupid, but people are constantly talking about wanting to translate from languages that they don't even know, including my husband, who translated a poem from French, and he doesn't speak a word of French. So, I mean, he had some help from a French speaker, but it's a mystery, but he really enjoyed it. His friend who's French thought he did a great job. So what is that? How good does your...
Well, okay, so first of all, I think as a translator into English, it's a good idea to know Italian well. It makes your job easier. But really, translation is all about English. It's what I have learned as a translator and why I have really loved translating so much as a writer is that translating really makes you know your language's limits, your language's capabilities. You have to immerse yourself absolutely in English. And I think in Anne's case, that's what she had done all her life. And so she was really well equipped to do that. People do this all the time. Poets especially translate from texts that they'll get a literal translation and then just listen to the music of the words, but you don't necessarily really have to know the language. It's interesting, Lydia Davis, who's a fabulous translator from the French, taught herself Norwegian by taking one of their most famous literary classics, a tome of 800 pages. She had no Norwegian, and she taught herself Norwegian by translating the book. So,
Kristin Lavransdatter?
It wasn't Kristin Lavransdatter, it was something more obscure that had never been translated before, but was a classic.
Other questions? Yes.
Actually, just to, before my question, just to follow up on that, not knowing the language well. I mean, think about people like Pavese, these translators of translators are almost like compilers of translations, where they weren't really translating the word directly, they were translating what other translators had already written, I had a question, but speaking of English, when I translate, I always think of the readership, right? And we know that there's more than just North American English, right? So when you're translating, how much do you try to balance, let's say, British English, and maybe even within Britain, Scottish English versus English, and then North American English? And just to give you one example, maybe you can spin off of it. I just got done translating a book, and it takes place mostly in the States. But I imagine a British reader reading it. So in some cases, I translated the parking lots as parking lots. In other cases, car parks. And someone might read it and go, "God, this guy's an idiot," or "He's schizophrenic," or But I took the risk anyway. So I don't know. What do you think about the target English, whether it should be British English, American English, a mix of the two, let's say?
That's a great question, and I'll just briefly say that the British will not take an American translation often. They'll have it retranslated because of things like that. Every time I hear us talk about the sweaters, it's like if I lived in England for 12 years, they would change so much in there in order for it to appeal to their audience. So that's a good point.
I would never translate into British English. Not that I don't appreciate it, but I think I'm translating for an American audience, and I wouldn't do it. And I did have the experience of translating something for an English publisher, and the copy editor then changed not actually that many things, but I thought it was sort of delicately done. I mean, I didn't recognize that I had written, I don't know, curb or something, I don't remember, or whatever they call sidewalks. Pavement, right? But I could see that it was done in a pretty in a sort of subtle way.
And I know that you translate the Elena Ferrante column for The Guardian. What happens there?
Well, the most interesting thing that happens is that there's a note from the editor in brackets saying, "Keep American spelling for the online version." No, they don't change. They haven't changed anything.
But audience is a very good question.
They have one or two things actually.
They do.
That come. Now I remember.
Yeah, I mean, audience is a very good question. Like, who are you translating for? And you do have to very much keep that in mind.
Giovanna, what do you do about that?
Well, the older translations of my father into English were in British English, and these seem to have aged more. And also, now I'm in America, so it's completely arbitrary and subjective, but I think that a British translation of my father is going to create a bit of a distance for the American reader. And there's this absurd thing in TV shows when there are shows about ancient Romans, they always have a British accent, which is ridiculous, which is so ridiculous. And if you make a film for an American audience, the Roman either make them speak Latin, otherwise just do a regular accent. So I'm all for catering to the audience, and yeah.
Other questions?
So earlier, I think it was Ms. Goldstein and Ms. McPhee, you both were talking about one of your Italian translation collaborations that you did together, and how you tried to keep the dialect while you were translating. Could you clarify a bit more? Did you mean like when you brought when you translated that you kept the Italian dialect like alongside for the reader to see, or was it more that you tried to bring that dialect into English and use the slang equivalent?
No, we left some phrases. We left some phrases. We left some phrases in.
So we left it absolutely in the dialect so that you can see the dialect as it was, and then a translation in English? It's an interesting question, because some people have taken dialect and translated it into maybe a southern pidgin kind of English, or translators have made choices like that. My personal feeling is that they don't work.
They don't work.
Yeah, but that's not a good choice, but
They just seem silly, or
silly, and it doesn't create that world.
It takes you right out of that world.
Yeah.
right?
You can't sort of you can't take Naples and put it in Atlanta. It just, it's not going to really work. I did have an interesting experience with the Curzio Malaparte book that I just translated, called The Kremlin Ball, in which the text was a third. It was a third of it was in French. So then, what do I do there? Because am I translating the French, all of the French? And in the end, what I did, I actually asked, I think, Anne's advice, but in the end, I did translate the French into English. But again, the whole thing is set in Moscow, and at that time, the Soviet elite were still speaking French. And so it was really important to the whole overall feeling of the book that I maintain the French. So a lot of times I would put in the French and then translate it after, or you try and weave into the text the meaning of the French that you're using, but it's more of that language difference.
Just to clarify that, you leave like the 4 Italian words and then you put an English in parentheses. I read a mystery series, and I think his name is Calamari.
Yes,
and he puts footnotes, and then he puts the translation and explains, which I always found very interesting. Now it's a much lower level.
I love those books, The Camilleri. I wanted to translate them. I didn't get the gig. I wish I had.
And would you have done that? I mean, he's still alive. He might have told the translator.
Yeah, that's true. I haven't read the English translations of that because I wanted to do it myself. So I just
So it's going to be bad.
But I do love footnotes, and that is a big issue with translators. Do you use footnotes or do you not use footnotes? And I love footnotes, and I use them a lot.
But they can be very off-putting for readers, intimidating and off-putting, especially in fiction.
Yeah.
If there are 2 of them, it's okay, but if there are more, it's tricky.
Yeah, no, it is very tricky.
I was just wondering, is there any time when you're translating a passage which you thought would harm the reputation of the writer if you translated it as it appeared? Or on the other hand, did you ever come to a point where you so disagreed with the passage that you didn't want to translate it the way you felt the author meant it?
I've never had that experience. Have you?
No, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly times when I'm like, really? But especially Malaparte, because he's a tough guy. But that's the challenge. Because as Anne was saying earlier, what we're really after is finding that voice and really giving that voice a voice in another culture. And so that includes all the horny and difficult, thorny, I guess the word is. I'm thinking Malaparte, who's very horny, so all of it, you kind of got to leave it there.
Yes.
Thanks. This is a treat, and I'd like the organizers to know that I read about it in Newsday.
Oh.
Sorry, I'm not from Hofstra, I'm from out there.
Oh, welcome.
And,
I'm so glad.
And it was just incredible because I had just finished My Brilliant Friend. I'm late to the party. I've owned the book for years, and I just finished it. And I saw this, and I said, oh my God. So I would love to go in a million directions. I would love to talk more about being fluent in Italian versus being fluent in English. You touched on that a bit. Knowing Naples and not knowing Naples, when you're writing about Naples. I just recently came to Naples as well. it's a whole new world. And you got it, but you say you don't know it that well. That's interesting too. But I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, Miss Goldstein, about a specific word. And that's in a scene where the gang goes into the ritzy part of town, Kiaya, I guess, and they encounter some young people all dressed up, whatever, and Reno feels he's insulted. He's insulted and he punches them and there's a whole big to-do. And the word he's insulted and I'm thinking, oh my God, here we go, the Italian insult. And you translated it as hick. And I thought, hick, if somebody called me a hick, how insulted would I be? I'm thinking to myself, there's got to be another word that really would have gotten to him. I'm sure you dealt with this. So I went back to the Italian and I tried to find other words, and I just wondered if you would talk about how you settled on that one.
Actually, I've studied that a little bit. It's one of the few dialect words in my brilliant friend. The word is tomaro. It means literally. That's what it means. It means like a boor, a peasant. Well, this is the series of words I went through: boor, peasant, yokel, redneck, and hick was the one that I finally settled on because it does mean something like that. I mean, yeah, I see what you mean. That maybe this would have been the moment to go away from the text and find something more insulting, if less exact.
Yeah.
But
I understand the problem, but
that's exactly the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love what you brought up about geography, though, and Anne and I faced that, and I'm sure Anne with the Ferrante books, but also in the Ortese, she knows Naples a lot better than I do, and geography is really important in the Ortese, but also Moscow in the Curzio Malaparte, which I don't know at all. So, I'm spending a lot of time on Google Maps and, really trying to figure that out because she wanders the streets of Naples all the time, and we really had to figure out a lot about that. And I actually wanted to do a whole translation panel on geography and translation because it's really important to translating the worlds.
And then for another time and another discussion, how about Southern writers versus Northern writers?
Really interesting.
I mean, I think Ortese is from
the South,
Naples,
but then she lived in the North, yeah.
Okay, because this Naples thing has just got me going.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for this event. It's really fantastic to have you all here. And my question is along the lines of the previous question. And you touched on it a little bit, like how do you prepare to describe a place that you're not very familiar with? And you have mentioned that you don't need to be very proficient in the language. We come from the language department. We teach Italian, French, and Spanish. So students, yes, get proficient in the language. But we also teach in our classes the cultural context of the places that speak these languages. And I understand that literature creates its own world, and it depends on the work of literature that it is, but many are very rooted in the social context, political context, cultural context of the writer. And I want to know, what is your process to get familiar with something, a place that you're not very familiar with, in terms of what are the rules that govern that universe? And you can take your OR classes if you want to get familiar.
Okay, so that's really important. That's why I love footnotes. But because, really part of the great thing for me about translating is I do massive amounts of research. For a lot of words. The words lead you to this, the references lead you to that, and it just opens up world after world. And then I love to pass that on to the reader through the footnote. It's a very important thing. I run not literary translation masters at NYU. And so it's all translation where you actually can make money. So legal, medical, financial. But the great big new area is something called transcreation and localization. So if Nike goes into Brazil and they go and they want to translate, just do it for the Brazilian audience, it's actually going to be very important that is translated in a way that's culturally appropriate, not just linguistically. So they'll change the whole thing, just do it, to something entirely different, but the idea and then if you go from Rio to São Paulo, maybe you have an entirely different campaign and a different translation. And so that work is now very important in the translation world. And I just wanted to make a recommendation to you. Domenico Starnone, who's being translated now by Jhumpa Lahiri, the theory is that he may be the husband of Elena Ferrante, but in any case, he writes a lot about, his books are really good, and they're coming out right now, and they're based in Naples.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. The translators will be signing books at the back of the theater. See you soon, I hope.